the importance of history, preserving the stories, preserving the history, and making sure that subsequent generations have some knowledge of what it all means.
Welcome back to the Commons for Justice podcast, the show that aims to engage the community in crucial, complex, and sometimes controversial discussions about the past, present, and future of race, risk, and resilience in coastal communities. I'm your host, Genai Witter, and today we are focused on Coconut Grove's historical past and current challenges, and exploring the roles of public policy and art with Dr. Valerie Patterson. Dr. Patterson is the director of FIU's African and African Diaspora Studies, a professor of public policy and administration, and a co-organizer on the Commons for Justice grant. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Patterson. Among being an incredibly multifaceted woman, Dr. Patterson is also a Coconut Grove native. I'd like to start off by exploring the story of Coconut Grove from your perspective, its history, challenges, and its resilience. So take us to the beginning. What was it like growing up in the Grove?
Thank you for the invitation to participate in this amazing podcast. And for me, it's thinking back to the uniqueness of growing up in Coconut Grove, a very small community where we knew each other, where people were very engaged and interacted, and as a community wanted us to succeed, right? But my grandmother left my mother a 2-story wooden house in Washington Avenue on Coconut Grove. And so growing up in my younger years, I had my family there who were taking care of me, but then I also had the boarders on the second floor who were considered family. But it was about being able to walk to nursery school, which is St. Albans, like a block away, and being able to walk to elementary school, being able to walk to middle school. But I say all that to say that there was a closeness. So I grew up next to Miss Mabel Thompson and her family. Miss Mabel's daughter, the eldest of her 9 children, was my 2nd and 3rd grade elementary school teacher.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so imagine what it feels like to know that you can go right next door and find your 2nd and 3rd grade school teacher. And so, again, it was this idea that we're all family. We all care about each other. We're all concerned. Education was stressed a lot. And so because of the closeness of the community, of how people knew each other, so it was, that kind of environment where you were encouraged to succeed. You were encouraged to read. You were encouraged to learn. So this notion of how far we've come as African descent people, African Americans, Bahamian descent people, and how far we have to go was instilled in us in elementary school. But then eventually, it reached a point where, so living in West Grove, kind of moved east up into the area that we call the village, right, where the neighborhoods were mixed, and then reaching a point where it just became too expensive, right? My daughter was maybe a year old. As a young family, paying rents and also trying to negotiate whether I was going to go on to complete my college education and my husband working, that it became too expensive to live there. Right? And so fast forward, many people, like my mother, for example, pre-COVID, could be counted on because she was a member of Christ Church, one of the historic churches in Coconut Grove. But as people moved to other parts of the city, maybe other parts of the country, the connections with the churches themselves. So in my mother's case, it's the pre-COVID, either dropping her to church or having someone come by and pick her up. And so it's thinking about now those connections, right? That
close-knit society.
Right. So how do you maintain those connections, and then what happens when they disappear? Right. Or what happens when you stay away from it for an extended length of time, and every time you return, another landmark, another historic site, another important cultural icon, if you will, that existed is gone. So there are people who have stayed, and I commend them, and I'm happy that they are there. They're still able to hold on to their family homes. But there's a constant sort of encroachment. There are people, there are entities who are interested in buying those homes, those family homes, and doing other things with them, right? So we participated in Goombay the last few years of the Mellon Grant. And this last year, Goombay in June, I took my mother to one of the receptions, and as we were leaving, we went down Day Avenue, which looks completely different from when she grew up in the Grove on Day Avenue, and when I grew up in the Grove. And so she was like, what is this? What's going on? Where did these homes come from? When did this change? Right? It's so I guess the word that I'm looking for is disorienting. Yeah. Because you drive down a street where you knew certain houses were, or people who you grew up with lived. Because you're thinking about, like, well, the people who move into those homes, will they have the same kind of relationship, and will they be able to engage and interact
in the same way that you guys
in the same way that we did when we were growing up in the Grove?
You know, and it's obviously clear that you have such a deep-rooted connection to the Grove, and I think that that's beautiful, and I think that that's a sentiment that a lot of Natives share. I mean, that's why I wanted to focus so much on Coconut Grove, because there's so much displacement and overdevelopment and gentrification happening there. And I feel like we need to kind of put the spotlight on that and talk about it a bit. The Dade Heritage Trust came out with a list of the 12 most endangered spaces of 2020. And a lot of these spaces and structures were notable sites in Coconut Grove, but also in a lot of similar communities in Miami that are facing overdevelopment or gentrification. The Grants Neighborhood Studies on the Grove conducted some studies into the lens of the community's past and the complexities that it faces today. And one of the studies revealed that the integration of Coconut Grove into Miami led to, obviously, racial segregation, disinvestment, and it disproportionately affected the Black community. You know, like you said, your family has been there for, 2-3 generations, and this community is majority Black or African descent or Bahamian descent, and they're being pushed out. It's this disinvestment and this kind of systemic thing that I feel like is happening. So I just wanted to talk about how do you think that these challenges have kind of shaped the community's identity, you know?
Right. So that's an interesting question, and you brought up important points that, as a woman who grew up in the Grove, give me pause to think about ultimately, what that means and how it has, impacted others, right? So I think about my own children who now have their own children, right? And their experience. And so they actually ended up attending elementary school in the Grove, and then they went on to school in South Miami. But by that point, we had already moved north, and they would come to visit their paternal grandmother. But they didn't have that same type of experience that I had.
And that goes back to that close-knit, it takes a village.
Right. Yeah. And so now, that especially as the neighborhood changes, and depending on the type of neighbors who you encounter, those experiences can become fewer and farther in between. So my daughter, she's in her 40s, and as I said, she spent time in the Grove, going to her grandmother's house. She doesn't remember when we lived in the Grove, when she was a toddler. but she understands the sort of importance of the history, and so now she's starting to ask certain questions about what it was like, what that experience was, what happened in our family.
Yeah.
But I think it's even important for younger generations, like the 20s, or even kids in high school, to be thinking about that history, and especially collecting it from people who are still here, who can talk about and explain and tell the story of the vibrancy, right? The concern, right? It's for people in my mother's generation. Really, they're really concerned about the changes that they see when those who live there in the Grove, when you see these huge apartment buildings, multi-dwelling buildings that will house hundreds of people in a spot where maybe 20 years ago, maybe it was 2 families, it was a duplex. And then the issue is, will they care about the community? So, for example, there was a time when the elementary school that I attended, there was talk of changing the name, right? And you're like, wait. There's a reason why it was called George Washington Carver, because there's a history behind that name. The principal, Miss Frances S. Tucker, who also lived in the Grove, she personally knew Dr. Carver.
That's crazy.
And she was the person who insisted and encouraged the name of that school to be named after Dr. Carver. And so for us, as kids, I remember in 3rd grade, the librarian saying and encouraging us to read these biographies of people like Dr. Carver, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, others. And for me, it was impressed upon me the importance of knowing that history. Exactly. Right? And then being constantly told that it was important that we attain our education and will make a contribution,
of course,
to society. Yep. Right?
You eat, everybody else has to eat.
You're right. So it points to the importance of history, preserving the stories, preserving the history, and making sure that subsequent generations have some knowledge of what it all means.
Exactly.
Right.
I want to go take a step back really quickly, because I know we talked about, I don't know, I feel like people say like, oh, like everything changes over time, but like this isn't a natural change. Like this, what's going on here isn't like a history normally progresses kind of thing. Like this is a intentional kind of reshaping or like erasure, honestly. And I want to touch on how climate change and climate challenges have contributed to this marginalization and this gentrification and overdevelopment. We know that marginalized communities often bear the brunt of climate vulnerabilities, including high heat, flooding, and hurricanes. And then on top of that, a lack of support from local governments amplified the risk of displacement and gentrification. So I really want to talk about how you think that these challenges have intertwined to create the perfect storm of risk for Coconut Grove and other marginalized and underserved communities in Miami.
So it's interesting because, I think back to how growing up, we had jealousy windows, right? We never had air conditioning. And I don't ever remember feeling like it's so hot outside, right? It was always that you're able to open the windows, you're able to catch that breeze, you're able to turn on the fan, if you will. the rotary fan and cool off. And then I'm thinking about now and what it must be like for people as the temperature, the climate increasingly changes. It creates additional kinds of vulnerabilities for people who are maybe living in communities that are under-resourced and that who don't have the economic means to make adjustments. We know the importance after Hurricane Andrew, we know the importance of having windows that ward off the high velocity winds. But what if you can't afford it? As we build these dwellings that go up so many floors and house hundreds of people, what if there are additional vulnerabilities that are created in that building? Growing up, I don't remember flooding. I remember a couple of storms. I heard about the hurricane of 26, and I heard about the hurricane where the pianos were floating down, Grand Avenue. I heard about that. I never experienced that. But I do know that when you have these conversations with people who were alive at that time, they would talk to you about Dade County pine, that you need to build with Dade County pine, and that you need to build a certain way. And that's what some of the expertise and the knowledge that Bahamians brought, living on these islands, that brought to Miami. So you need to build in a certain way that creates less vulnerabilities for the dwelling. But what if now, as this overdevelopment occurs, what if the developers aren't heeding, the lessons of the past?
Exactly.
And not only are they creating vulnerabilities for people who live in those dwellings, but what if they're creating vulnerabilities for people who live in surrounding areas? But again, it's the importance of ensuring that you're not creating additional vulnerabilities. So in the past, growing up, and even as an adult and experiencing hurricanes, if something happens, we go out, you get water, you get other kinds of non-perishable items. And what you try to do is, once the storm passes, because you know your neighbors, you look out, right? You make sure you have enough for others. You may share resources that you have. But what if you don't know your neighbors? What if you don't have that kind of relationship? And that there, so you hear stories about people who may have been isolated or vulnerable, but no one knew they were there. Their neighbors didn't know them. They're elderly. The neighbors didn't know them. They didn't know that that person was there alone. And they suffer some kind of adverse consequence as a result of some major catastrophic event, right?
And that's going back, that sense of community resilience. And that's something that I feel like governments and scientists kind of shy away from, in terms of not acknowledging, I call it the duality of expertise, And also going back to you were talking about how the Dade County pine, Bahamian immigrants brought over, and that is government or local scientists or organizations may be like, oh, we don't need to bring these people to the table because they don't have XYZ qualification, but they know things. And this is exactly, they know how to rebuild their communities because they have been for centuries, for generations. I just really like that you shed a light on that.
When you didn't attend architecture school, you didn't attend engineering school, but you have that expertise. But so that having that expertise and having some sense of, where vulnerabilities might exist and what you might do to ensure that they're shored up and survive whatever it is that, you might encounter.
Yeah. And I want to talk about your role as director of the African and African Diaspora Studies program. I feel like it shines a light on the minority experiences and the experiences of the Black and African diaspora perspectives. So we were talking about this theme earlier, about government relationships with underserved communities and these barriers to communities of color. So I want to know your insights on the larger conversation. So, like, how do you think that race plays a role in all of this?
So, again, for me, it's the inequities that might exist in the system, right? I saw it when we went from segregated middle school to a desegregated high school. The kids were thrown together. And we had this opportunity to interact and engage with kids who we had never gone to school with before, who lived in communities other than our own. And I had a friend in high school who lived on Key Biscayne. And so, we're working on a yearbook, and we go to her to work on a yearbook at her house, and it was so different. It was totally not my experience at all. And to see, I had high school classmates who had their own apartments and were driving Benzes. And I think when we growing up in the Grove, and I've had this conversation with other friends who I went to school with, we really didn't know we were poor. We didn't consider ourselves poor. We didn't realize that there are other kinds of opportunities. I remember being in high school when colleges came to visit, and the council would only direct us to certain schools and certain colleges, and we weren't aware of redlining, right? We didn't know that there's such a thing as kids, and even as adults. We weren't, or young adults. We went to an apartment that we saw rented, a house that we saw for rent, and we show up, and the person who was supposed to show us the apartment, he comes out, he takes one look at us, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, people have a fit if I rent it to you." Right? That would have been a major discrimination case, but I didn't know about the legislation that existed to protect us in that way. I mean, I remember the difference in how we were received when we went to Virginia Key Beach, the Black Beach, and when my play aunt from North Carolina started taking us. She would come down with my twin cousins in the summer, and she would take us to Government Cut, which, quote unquote, wasn't integrated at the time, and like being called the N-word. So again, it's that there were those kinds of experiences. I remember field trips when we were at Carver, having to sit in the balcony because we're Black, and that the kids who were white sat on the main level of the theater on the first floor. And so that the race, it was explicit, and then it was also implicit
as well,
right? The bias was there in different ways, and that ultimately impacted certain decisions and opportunities that we had access to. Right. And so I think that while things have changed, in some ways they haven't.
No, yeah.
Right. So that the inequities, the structural elements that exist continue to impact students, individuals, people in different ways. So you encounter the biases. Some of them are explicit, some of them are not. But people make decisions about what they think you can and cannot do, and what you're capable of, and what you're probably not capable of, and it has an impact.
Yeah, no, and I think that even you were talking about the opportunities that different people are faced with. I think that also can translate over to now and to these rising house prices and like all of this, like because of the history, the people who used to live there can't afford to live there anymore because of this history of racialized like behavior in Miami and in America in general. I mean, and goes back to that the overlooking of people's expertise and their ability to bring ideas and solutions to the table. And I think that often government relations with underserved communities fall into this like pitfall of solutionism or like quote unquote colorblindness. They will say, oh, we're going to go into this community and fix this. And natives or marginalized people aren't brought to the table to talk about, hey, like, this is what I want. This is the history behind this thing. Like, let's work together and fix this, you know? And as a professor of public policy and administration, I wanted to talk about what you believe needs to be done on like a systemic level to ensure that these communities are able to withstand these challenges. I also want to know how you, as a Black woman and a native to Coconut Grove, how do you like navigate these spaces where like you have this duality? How do you balance that, you know, and how do you advocate for your community in these spaces?
It's an important question, right? And so as soon as I realized that as a part of the Mellon grant that we were working with organizations in the Grove, and we were working with community members in the Grove, I was really excited about that because I think that is a major role that we need to fulfill as an institution. I mean, it's a part of our mission as a university. Our mission is to contribute, elevate, facilitate, and make lives better within the university and in external communities. If we are a part of initiatives that are focused on the community, we want to leave the footprint that we want to leave in those communities, that we've made things better and not worse, right? And that it's all about relationships and sustaining those relationships. And so I hope that as an institution, we understand the importance of being community engaged and facilitating community engaged scholarship.
Exactly.
Right? And so that's, that's my goal, to always participate and be a part of community focused research. But again, it's the ensuring that people are listened to. So, what we've learned is community empowerment is important, and that the solutions to issues and challenges need to be centered in the community.
Exactly.
Right? That we're not in the business of telling people that we know what's best.
Yeah.
As a person who teaches in public policy and administration, I get the whole e-government thing, right? That is supposed to create access.
Yeah.
But for whom? Right? Because, I'm a baby boomer. And even I, with all the years that I've been dealing with and interacting with technology, I feel some kind of way about scanning my QR code. So we're going to expect that people in their 80s are going to be scanning QR codes and going online to find out different kinds of information about government services. No. Yeah. So for me, it's putting on my PA hat, public policy and administration hat, is meeting the people we serve where they are. Exactly. In the way that they're empowered and they're able to access the services that are available.
How do you think that the grant kind of showcases like a commitment to aiding in actionable solutions, but also meeting people where they are? Like,
everyone who I know who has been a part of this grant have been very intentional in letting people know that we're interested in what's going on in your community. We have resources, we have some answers. We don't have all of the answers, but We can help find the answers. We can help facilitate and create connections across communities in Miami. This grant has provided opportunities for those of us in the academy who really care about community engaged scholarship. It's allowed us to interact and engage with folks. It's allowed us to share our expertise. It's allowed us to learn more of the history of the communities, and again, hopefully create and foster long-term relationships that will extend beyond this present work. I think we've done that.
I think that the grant definitely is a necessary force in this field, I want to pivot a little bit back to something that you said earlier about a commitment to preserving history and culture can foster resilience, like, in these communities. And I want to know, like, how you as a Native feel about these spaces being considered endangered and how preserving these spaces would kind of foster resilience within certain communities.
So I look at the Ace Theater on Grand Avenue, right? An important community location for many years, and we're thankful to the Wallace family for purchasing the property and then getting it declared historic, and now continuing to work on ensuring that it can reopen and be a site for cultural production. For example, the project that came out of architecture, the reimagining Grand Avenue of the 60s and 70s, right? And how excited people were when they saw the renderings and the taking history and technology and reimagining what things were like at that point. So I think that having people look back and think about how those historical sites and that history had a major impact on people in the community at that time. And then having them look at what's going on now, like we're in this process of revitalization, that it helps them to tap into the stories of resilience that may have taken place up to this point, and it helps them to imagine and think about what might be needed to ensure that the community remains resilient.
Exactly. I think one of the things I was drawn to the most out of your incredibly multifaceted career is your role as an artist. Like, I think that is so cool. And I want to talk about the transformative power of art. In your MBUS live talk about art, you mentioned learning doll making from your aunt and your unfamiliarity with it, or with a sewing machine, like at the initial stages of your art making. And I wanted to know, as an artist, how do you think that artistic expression can play a role in knowledge sharing for the future generations, but also how it can foster resistance?
What I've learned as an artist is I'm drawn to images, and I'm drawn to the possibilities of how you can collage and pull together images and convey. I mean, ultimately, it's in the eye of the beholder, right?
Exactly,
This whole notion of art. So I'm always fascinated by getting the reflections of people when they see my art. And so at the exhibit, was asked by the curators, what is my favorite piece, right? The one that means the most to me, that has had a tremendous impact, is this one doll. I mean, I started working on that doll, I want to say, maybe 20 years ago. But over the years, I've added different elements. And, she also has images of different people from my family and others quilted onto, her clothing. Yeah, it was capturing what I wanted it to convey. So kind of complex and layered, and I mean it really is. There are all kinds of stories, and so I think that's how art can be used. For this year, for Asala, that's another organization that I belong to, Association for the Study of African American Life and History. They've been having an annual conference, and each year the conference has a theme, and what it is the theme for Black History Month, right? So Black History Month for 2023 and for the year is Black Resistance. So those ideas then I try to embed in the art that I'm working on. So what does Black Resistance look like?
Yeah.
And who is reflective of Black resistance to me? And so like the latest collage that I'm working on that I, ultimately hope to develop into some art that I'm gonna wear. I like to create these jackets or whatever. So far, I have Paul Robeson on it, and I'm going to put Ida B. Wells in it. Fannie Lou Hamer is on it. Ella Baker is on it. And
icons.
Right, icons, right? But also that they realize the importance of advancing the cause. They realized that structural racism was all around us in different ways, and that we needed to challenge it. We needed to ensure that it was destroyed, and we needed to create more equity, right? So they gave us lessons. They offered different types of examples of ways to resist.
I love that.
And engage in other types of behavior to challenge the status quo in a certain way. Some of them ultimately suffered in different ways. Many times when we're being challenged and confronting obstacles, that we engage in the creation of our best art, but also our most innovative thinking, right? Because it's about imagining other ways of doing things.
Under pressure.
Right? And so I think that's what art allows us to do. In my art, I hope that when people view it, especially when I wear my art, I'm always hoping that somebody's going to say either they know the person or they're going to ask me about like, who is that?
An opportunity for knowledge sharing.
Right, yeah. People ask about like, who is it?
So I want to know your vision or your hopes for the future of the grant, but also the future of Coconut Grove and Miami.
Right. So I'm going to applaud and commend Mellon Foundation for supporting this work here and around the country. So what I hope to do is to find a way to, beyond the grant itself, for us to continue to have the opportunity to engage and interact with the communities.
A sustainable thing. Yeah.
Right. For it to be very sustainable, for there to be lessons that come out of this work that we can share with other communities, right, around the country that are similar to the communities who we work with in Miami, right? And so we hope that we're creating models, the models of sustainability, models of resilience, that we're creating those types of takeaways and lessons. So I know that's happening, and I hope very strongly that it continues.
Yeah.
Right, beyond this work, because it's been very rewarding work. It's nothing like being able to interact and engage with a community where you grew up. I want to continue to see university make a contribution in that way. I think there are major lessons out that come out of those neighborhood stories, and I want to see that work incorporated in courses. And I'm really encouraged by how many students I hear discuss resilience and sustainability. I'm really encouraged by this awareness of, especially in younger generations, your generation and even the ones to follow, that it's incumbent upon us to leave the planet, leave our communities in a better place.
In a better way that we found it.
That we found them, and that we can't be using up all of the resources and destroying the water and littering and overusing plastics in a way that destroys the environment. So I'm encouraged that students are focused and aware of those issues and are demanding change.
Yeah.
Right. And so I hope that continues. and that we continue as an institution to provide opportunities for our students to engage our local communities, learn from those communities, and then sort of build their expertise.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on here and speaking to us, Dr. Patterson.
I enjoyed it. It was great. It was great.
As we wrap up this episode, consider the roles each of us can play in preserving our community's historical narratives and how we can weave our own experiences into the collective fabric of our community's identity. And as always, what are your hopes for the future, and how can you challenge yourself to become an advocate for change? Until next time, continue exploring, questioning, and advocating for a world where justice is the common thread weaving us all together. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Commons for Justice podcast.